There are men who seem to be born as mirrors for time itself, not through intellect, but through a strange awareness that slips beyond the borders of centuries. Edgar Cayce was one of them. They called him the sleeping prophet. When his eyes closed, another voice emerged, deeper, wiser, and impossibly ancient, a voice that spoke of things no ordinary mind could know. In those trance readings, meticulously recorded over decades, Cayce described illnesses he had never studied, places he had never seen, and events that would unfold long after his death. He foresaw the 1929 stock market crash, the rise and fall of 2 world wars, and even the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, decades before they were found. Each prophecy, when revisited through the lens of history, forms a chilling mosaic of accuracy and mystery that continues to baffle scholars and skeptics alike. Some call him proof of the hidden power of the human spirit. Others dismiss him as a dreamer lost in his own imagination. But to millions, Edgar Cayce stood as a bridge between the seen and the unseen, between what is and what might be. Across more than 14,000 documented readings, Cayce returned again and again to one haunting vision: America entering a great tribulation, a time when the nation would be divided against itself, when the seas would rise in fury, and when a man symbolizing the builder would be tested beyond imagination. He never said a name. He only left symbols, fragments, and cryptic phrases. When the man of commerce holds the highest seat, the house of democracy shall be divided within itself. What made those lines unsettling was not their poetry, but their precision, especially the time frame he spoke of, the mid-2020s. He described years of earth changes and political upheaval, a period that would culminate in a single moment of decision. In the records, the year 2026 appears again and again, not as the end of the world, but as a trial by fire when the leader of the nation would face a choice between 2 paths, one leading toward humility and renewal, the other toward pride and ruin. Born in 1877 in the small rural town of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, Cayce lived an unremarkable life. He was a farmer's son, a photographer by trade, a gentle soul with no formal education beyond the 8th grade. But when he entered a deep sleep, his face would change, his breathing slow, and words began to flow from his lips in a language that felt ancient and precise. Witnesses claimed his voice became calm and plural, as if several entities spoke through him. He would say, "We have the record," as though he were channeling a collective consciousness. In that strange, half-lit state, he dictated prophecies about medicine, reincarnation, the history of Atlantis, and the unseen cycles of the earth. But near the end of his life, his readings began to focus on one subject more than any other: the future of the United States. He spoke of a cleansing that must come to awaken the soul of the nation, of the seas rising and the ground trembling, not as punishment, but as reminders of a forgotten balance between spirit and matter. When man forgets that his purpose is service to others, he warned, the earth itself will remind him through the shaking of its body. Cayce died in 1945, just as World War II was ending, yet the ripples of his visions did not fade. His readings were preserved, studied, and revisited by generations who found eerie reflections of his words in their own time. Decades later, his references to a builder, a man of wealth and gold, and a second test of power began to stir new interpretations, particularly as the world watched a familiar figure rise once again to the pinnacle of American leadership. And so, the old prophecy returned, breathing through the pages of his dusty transcripts, pointing toward a date not far from now. Could Cayce, speaking from his trance in the 1930s, have glimpsed the image of a man who would appear nearly a century later, a man surrounded by towers, draped in gold, promising to make America great again? Or is it simply coincidence, the echo of human history repeating itself under new names? One truth remains: Cayce never claimed the future was fixed. Prophecy, he said, is not destiny, it is warning. The future, to him, was like a river with many channels, and every decision carved a new path. Perhaps that is why his words linger, half warning and half hope. That 2026 is not a sentence, but a signpost. And as that signpost draws near, it calls each of us, from the powerful to the humble, to look closely at which current we are choosing to follow. Among the many fragments buried in Edgar Cayce's readings, few are as haunting as those describing the figure who would rise during the time of division. In multiple transcripts from the 1930s and early 1940s, he spoke of a man of commerce, a leader not born of politics, but of profit. He would come to power through unconventional means, Cayce said, standing apart from the political dynasties that had ruled before him. This man would build towers that reached the sky, monuments of wealth and ambition, and his very name would become synonymous with gold. When researchers began re-examining these passages in the 21st century, they noticed an unsettling resemblance between Cayce's words and a living figure who had already reshaped the American political landscape. A businessman who literally built towers, wrapped his name in gold, and divided the nation with words that sparked both devotion and outrage. Cayce had never known this man, of course. He died long before Donald Trump's birth. Yet the symbolism fits almost too neatly, as if the prophet had seen a reflection of the future shimmering through a fog of time. In one of his most cited readings, numbered 1152-111, Cayce described this leader as facing the temptation of the money changers, a biblical phrase evoking Christ's fury in the temple. The passage reads, "When the man of commerce holds the highest office, the nation shall face a choice between the power of gold and the welfare of its people. One path shall lead to renewal through sacrifice, the other to ruin through pride." What did Cayce see when he spoke of the power of gold? Was it literal, an obsession with wealth, luxury, and markets, or something deeper, a metaphor for materialism eclipsing the soul of a nation? His language, as always, leaves room for both. In the trance, he often described visions in layers, as if reality itself was composed of multiple planes, the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual. He believed leaders were not chosen by chance, but by resonance, that every ruler mirrors the collective state of the people they lead. As a nation thinks in its heart, he said, so it becomes. If that principle holds, then the rise of a businessman to the presidency was not simply coincidence, it was a reflection. The nation's hunger for strength, prosperity, and the illusion of control during an age of uncertainty. Yet Cayce warned that such power comes with a mirror of its own. He wrote, "When the builder becomes the destroyer, the balance is lost, and the land must quake to find its center again." The builder and destroyer, two faces of the same man. Throughout his readings, Cayce rarely spoke of individuals by name. Instead, he painted archetypes: the ruler who leads by fear, the healer who forgets compassion, the merchant who becomes king. In this way, his prophecy transcends any single person. It speaks to the cyclical nature of history itself. Every civilization, he claimed, reaches a point when material success overshadows spiritual awareness. That is when nature begins to rebel and destiny calls for a test. The mid-2020s, he said, would be such a time. In the vision, he saw waters rising where there had been dry land, and the mountains trembling as the voices of nations rise in conflict. At the same time, a leader, the man of towers, would stand at a crossroads, confronted by the consequences of his own ambition. Would he learn humility and lead the people toward reconciliation, or double down on division, feeding the storm instead of calming it? It is tempting to interpret these words politically, but Cayce's intent was spiritual. The tower in his language was not just a skyscraper, it was a symbol of pride, recalling the Tower of Babel, mankind's ancient attempt to reach heaven by its own strength. In the Bible, that tower ended not with triumph, but with confusion, a scattering of tongues and hearts. Cayce drew from that same imagery, warning that the pursuit of greatness without balance would fracture the very foundation of a nation. And so, as the 21st century unfolds and those old symbols take form again, the question Cayce left behind grows sharper. Was his builder of towers a prophecy of one man, or an allegory of all humanity, of our obsession with power, control, and monuments to the self? If it is the latter, then the test he foresaw is not one leader's alone. It is the test of a civilization standing atop its own creation, wondering whether it has built a sanctuary or a tomb. For Cayce, prophecy was never about inevitability. It was about warning, about reflection. He urged his followers to remember that every vision of destruction contained the seed of redemption. The end of one age, he said, is but the beginning of another. Whether that new age would be born through peace or through chaos depended entirely on choice, the most human gift of all. And as the clock inches toward the mid-2020s, and as the world once again trembles under the weight of uncertainty, the image of the Man of Towers returns, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. It asks a simple, impossible question. When the builder stands before his own creation and sees it begin to crack, will he reach for the hammer or the healing hand? If the story of Edgar Cayce had ended with mysterious dreams and poetic warnings, it might have been forgotten as a curiosity of the past. But within his readings lies something far more unsettling, a pattern that connects the fate of nations with the trembling of the earth itself. In several sessions given between 1934 and 1939, Cayce spoke of what he called earth changes, violent shifts in weather, earthquakes where there had been none, seas rising, and lands swallowed whole. He described these not as random disasters, but as symptoms, physical manifestations of moral imbalance on a planetary scale. Reading 3976-15, dated January 19, 1934, stands as one of his most haunting. Cayce said, "The earth will break in many places. The South Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the coastlines of the Americas shall feel its fury. These changes will come as warnings to those who hold power, that the balance of the world must be restored." To him, nature was the conscience of humanity made visible. It trembled when human greed and pride reached their peak. Nearly a century later, his words echo across our headlines. Record hurricanes, the slow drowning of coastal cities, fault lines stirring beneath the Pacific, ice shelves collapsing at the poles. Scientists explain these as climate shifts, tectonic cycles, data points. But Cayce saw them as part of a much older rhythm, the Earth's own response to human arrogance. As above, so below, he would often say. The storms within us are mirrored by the storms around us. Yet the readings were not simply ecological prophecies. They were political as well. In another session, 1152-111, given in 1939, Cayce warned that democracy itself would tremble as surely as the ground beneath it. The house will not fall from invasion, he said, but from the weight of division. The test, he claimed, would reach its peak when the man of commerce commands the people's trust. That line, the man of commerce, has haunted interpreters ever since. It paints a moment when material ambition and national spirit collide, when the pursuit of wealth overshadows the ideals that once bound the people together. He described a time when leaders would face impossible choices, protect economic empires at the cost of justice, or sacrifice prosperity to preserve the soul of the nation. Whichever choice was made would determine not only the fate of a country, but the stability of the earth itself. To Cayce, spiritual corruption and physical disaster were intertwined, two ends of the same thread. Imagine the world as he saw it, storms tearing across coasts, the ground shaking beneath towers of glass, and within the marble halls of government, the same trembling, not of stone, but of conscience. Cayce's words become a kind of mirror held up to our age. The earth reflects the hearts of men, he said. When they quake, so does it. Some have dismissed this as metaphor, but even metaphors have a way of becoming prophecy when the conditions align. The divisions Cayce foresaw, social, political, spiritual, are no longer future tense. They live among us, vibrating in every conversation, every news cycle, every headline. His image of the house divided feels less like prediction and more like diagnosis. What makes the connection between earth changes and leadership so profound is the symbolism of accountability. The tremor, the flood, the storm, all become a kind of celestial referendum, testing not just governments, but values. In this light, 2026 is not a date of destruction. It is a deadline for introspection. If the warnings of Cayce are to be believed, the earth itself is calling humanity back to balance before the scales tip too far. Even within the prophetic tone, Cayce's message carried an undercurrent of compassion. He never spoke of punishment, he spoke of correction. Every ending is a healing, he said, but the fever must break before recovery. To him, disasters were not the wrath of God, but the cleansing of a fevered world. The very word tribulation meant trial, not annihilation, an opportunity for renewal through suffering. And perhaps that is why the imagery of shaking ground and rising seas resonates so deeply with our modern anxieties. Because beneath the geological and political turmoil lies a moral question. What happens when civilization builds higher than its conscience can sustain? Cayce's answer, whispered through time, is both terrifying and tender. The earth will remind us of what we've forgotten. When we read his transcripts today, the parallels are difficult to ignore. The Pacific breaking up, as he wrote, could refer to tectonic plates or to the fragile alliances stretching across the ocean. The Mediterranean in unrest might just as well mean the cradle of Western civilization convulsing under social and spiritual strain. And the American coasts, the borders between land and water, wealth and vulnerability, may symbolize the thin line between order and chaos that every empire must eventually confront. To Cayce, all of it led to one inevitability: the convergence of crisis and leadership. The earth, he said, would not move without reason. It would shake to awaken the hearts of those who have fallen asleep to the truth of who they are. And when it does, when the ground beneath our towers begins to shift, the true measure of a leader will not be his strength, but his humility. In the long arc of Cayce's Prophecies, one moment shines with an almost electric intensity: the year of testing. He spoke of it as the second period of influence, a time when the builder would once again ascend to power and face the reflection of everything he had created. For decades, those words seemed to hang in limbo, an enigma without context. But when the calendar turned to 2025, and the familiar figure of the Man of Towers re-emerged upon the world stage, the meaning grew impossible to ignore. Cayce never mentioned elections or nations by name, yet his descriptions align with uncanny precision. He said that in this second season of rule, the leader of the West would confront a choice so vast that its consequence would ripple through every continent. He will stand at the crossroads, Cayce wrote, between the way of dominion and the way of deliverance. The choice will not be his alone, for the hearts of the people will decide which voice he hears. That line, the hearts of the people, carries a strange resonance. It suggests that prophecy is not a story about one man, but a mirror for millions. What happens to the leader, Cayce implied, depends on the consciousness of the nation itself. The ruler is but the reflection of the ruled, he said in another reading. If pride dominates the people, pride will rise in the throne. If compassion rules their hearts, then compassion will rule the land. And so, 2026 emerges in his vision as the moment when this reflection reaches its climax, the second trial. Not merely political, but existential. The builder, now burdened by his own legacy, stands in the storm of converging crises, earthquakes that shake the coasts, economies straining under invisible weight alliances trembling between war and peace, and the relentless judgment of law itself closing around him. Cayce foresaw that the Man of Towers would be surrounded by trials, legal, moral, and spiritual, but warned that the verdict of the courts would matter less than the verdict of his own soul. Reading 257-254, dated March 1935, contains one of the most striking passages. He who built the high places shall face the judges of men, but the greater judgment will come from within, for no power can remove that which he condemns in himself. Cayce's phrasing blurs the boundary between metaphor and reality. The high places could mean literal towers or the loftier heights of authority and ego. Either way, the image is clear. The builder's creation becomes the scene of his own reckoning. In 2026, according to Cayce's timeline, all the strands tighten. Natural disasters, social upheaval, and political division converge into a single knot. Some of his followers interpret this as an economic collapse, echoing his earlier readings that predicted the failure of the old financial order. Others see in it the shadow of war, a reawakening of global conflict between East and West. Still others perceive something more intimate, a spiritual crisis, not just for one leader, but for the entire nation he represents. Cayce never offered a single outcome, only probabilities. He described two paths, one of transformation, one of ruin. When the builder becomes the redeemer, he said, the world will find peace. But if he remains the destroyer, the world will learn through the ashes of its pride. His language recalls the alchemical idea of the second fire, a burning not meant to punish, but to purify. The second trial, then, is not a punishment upon the man, but an invitation to transmute what he once embodied: ego into service, division into unity, power into humility. Imagine that moment through Cayce's eyes: storms battering the coastlines, markets quivering, the air thick with uncertainty. The man of towers, older now, no longer the golden builder but a figure weathered by consequence, looks out from his creation and feels the weight of history pressing down. In the stillness between chaos and decision, he is offered the same question every soul must face: what will you do with what you've built? In one vision, Cayce saw the builder laying down the instruments of pride, choosing reconciliation over vengeance, using the power of influence to unite rather than divide. In that future, America becomes not the empire of wealth, but the lighthouse of compassion, guiding a weary world through the storm. The fire will cleanse, but not consume, he said, if humility lights the flame. But in another vision, the darker one, the choice goes the other way. The leader hardens his heart, blames others, and clings to the illusion of control. The people mirror him, division deepens, and as the moral balance of the nation fractures, the earth itself answers. Cayce foresaw waves crashing over cities, the shaking of mountains, and the loss of lands long considered eternal. Then shall the old coasts disappear, he warned, and new lands arise where the faithful shall dwell. Even in that vision of destruction, there is renewal. Cayce never described apocalypse as the end, only as a rebirth through pain. Every civilization, he believed, must eventually face the consequences of its own arrogance and choose whether to rebuild or to vanish. The second trial is simply the moment that choice can no longer be postponed. Perhaps that is why his words still resonate. Because whether or not one believes in prophecy, every generation faces its own 2026, a moment when the ground shakes and what we've built begins to crack. And in that moment, each of us, like the builder himself, must decide, will we hold tighter to what is falling apart or let go and build something truer from the dust? Edgar Cayce's final lesson was not one of doom, but of awakening. He never spoke like a preacher calling down fire. He spoke like a healer describing the fever before recovery. His readings were full of storms and tremors, yes, but beneath the destruction, there was always an undercurrent of grace. To Cayce, prophecy existed not to terrify, but to offer a chance, the chance to turn before the wave crests. He warned that the mid-2020s would mark a reckoning in the hearts of men, a testing of what humanity had learned from its long dance with pride. Every nation, he said, must live what it claims to believe. America, a land built on ideals of liberty and unity, would face a trial revealing whether those words still carried meaning or had become empty echoes of a forgotten dream. And the man who stood at its helm, the builder, the man of towers, would be the mirror through which the world watched that test unfold. Cayce's most compassionate insight is also his most easily missed. That prophecy is not a prison, but a doorway. No fate is fixed, he repeated throughout his life. Every vision can be changed when man turns toward the light. That turning, however, requires humility, the willingness to admit that power alone cannot save a soul, nor can ambition repair what only love can heal. He saw the future as a living organism, always shifting with our choices. The moment the heart repents, he said, the timeline bends. Imagine the scene as he described it. The year is 2026. The world trembles with overlapping crises, storms along the coasts, fractures in alliances, markets reeling, faith in leadership shaken. The air hums with anxiety, but within that chaos there is a silence, a stillness, a window of decision. Cayce believed that such moments were sacred, that history itself pauses to listen. He will be offered a choice, he said of the leader, to build or to break, to heal or to harden, and the nation will breathe with him. Some interpret this purely politically, a choice between peace and war, between economic control and human freedom. But Cayce's vision moves deeper into the realm of spirit. The leader in his prophecy could be anyone, any of us, when faced with the temptation to rule by pride or to lead by love. The destiny of an age, he taught, is written not by kings or presidents, but by the collective heartbeat of its people. If the nation prays for light, light will come. If it hungers for vengeance, darkness will answer. In the gentlest of his readings, he compared humanity to a sleeping child, restless and afraid, tossing between dreams of destruction and rebirth. When man awakens, he said, he will see that the dream was his own creation. Perhaps the prophecies of 2026 are nothing more or less than that, a collective dream warning us of what happens when we forget that we are the dreamers. There is an undeniable symmetry in the image Cayce left behind. The builder standing before his own creation, the towers gleaming like mirrors, the earth beneath them shifting, the people watching. The old systems tremble, the illusions begin to fall. And in that moment, the future hangs on something utterly simple, the courage to choose compassion. For Cayce, mercy was not weakness, it was the highest form of strength, the act that could transform a nation's karma in a single heartbeat. He believed that America's destiny, and by extension humanity's, was to become a beacon of spiritual awakening, not through domination but through example. The world awaits a people who remember, he wrote, for remembrance is salvation. To remember what? That the divine spark, the source of all prophecy and all power, lives within every human being, waiting to be stirred awake. As we edge toward the years Cayce marked with trembling ink, his words feel less like predictions and more like invitations. They whisper to us across nearly a century, the storm will come, but you are not the storm. The shaking of the earth is only the shaking of our own souls, asking to be rebuilt on foundations that cannot crumble, empathy, humility, truth. And if he was right about that, then 2026 is not a year of destruction, but a year of possibility, a doorway through which an old world may collapse and a wiser one may rise. Whether the builder redeems himself, whether nations reconcile, whether the earth steadies its breath, all of it rests on the same fragile truth Cayce repeated again and again. The future is not written in stone, but in the hearts of those who dare to choose love over fear. So as the clock draws closer to that mysterious horizon, the sleeping prophet's voice seems to echo louder, not from the grave, but from within. It reminds us that prophecy is not about predicting the end. It is about remembering that the end is also a beginning. The question is not what will happen in 2026. The question is, what will we choose when it arrives? And perhaps, somewhere beyond time, Edgar Cayce still whispers that same prayer for humanity, that we wake before the storm, that we learn before the fall, and that we finally remember who we are.